My name is Sarah Michelle Thompson, and the day my sister Jessica laughed at my $20 grocery budget, I knew something fundamental had shifted between us. She stood there in her designer heels, fresh from the salon, holding a receipt that cost more than I made in a week. "That's just loose change to us, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of pity that cuts deeper than anger. "You wouldn't understand what real money looks like." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had just walked away from a meeting where someone had called me Miss Thompson with the kind of reverence reserved for people who mattered, where papers were spread across mahogany desks bearing numbers that would have made Jessica's designer lifestyle look modest. But I let her keep talking, let her dig the hole deeper, because sometimes the most powerful response is silence. The Riverside Country Club buzzed with the kind of forced elegance that money could rent, but not buy. Crystal glasses clinked against polished marble, while servers in pressed uniforms glided between tables laden with food most people couldn't pronounce. I stood near the bar in my simple black dress from Target, nursing a club soda while watching my sister Jessica command the room like she owned it. This was her 5th wedding anniversary party, though if you asked her, she'd call it a celebration of their success. I had arrived exactly when the invitation specified, not early enough to help set up, not late enough to be noticed. That was my place in this family dynamic, present but peripheral, invited but not included. My father Bob stood near the buffet table, his insurance company name tag finally removed for the evening, talking animatedly with Jessica's husband David about golf handicaps and stock portfolios. My presence warranted a brief nod when I walked in, the kind you give to service staff who blend into the background. The country club felt like a museum of things I supposedly couldn't afford. Leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent, artwork that screamed expensive rather than beautiful, and an atmosphere thick with the weight of people who needed everyone to know they belonged here. I had chosen my spot carefully, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid the inevitable conversations about my life choices. Jessica floated through her guests in a cream-colored cocktail dress that cost more than most people's car payments. She had always been the golden child, the one who married well, the one who understood the importance of appearances. Tonight she was in her element, receiving congratulations and admiration like they were her due. Every gesture was calculated for maximum impact, every smile precisely calibrated to convey success and satisfaction. "Sarah, honey, you look tired." Amanda Rivera materialized beside me like smoke, her voice carrying that particular brand of concern that wasn't concern at all. Amanda was Jessica's sister-in-law, an interior designer who treated every conversation like a consultation for someone who couldn't afford her services. "Are you still working at that little coffee place downtown?" I took a sip of my club soda, ice clinking softly against glass. "Brewster's Coffee House, yes, I enjoy it there." Her laugh was delicate and sharp. "How charming. It must be so freeing not to worry about career advancement or building wealth. Some people are just meant for simpler lives." The words hung in the air like perfume, sweet on the surface but cloying underneath. I had heard variations of this conversation for years, the subtle and not so subtle suggestions that I had somehow chosen incorrectly, that my life was a series of limitations rather than deliberate decisions. They spoke about me like I was a child who hadn't learned to want more, as if contentment was a character flaw. Across the room, Jessica caught sight of our conversation and began making her way over, her heels clicking authoritatively against the polished floor. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no about anything that mattered, never been made to wait for what she wanted, never been dismissed as unimportant. Her husband David followed a step behind, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his smile the practiced expression of a lawyer who billed by the hour. "Amanda, are you keeping my little sister company?" Jessica's voice carried across the small space between us, drawing attention from nearby guests. "Sarah doesn't get out much anymore. We worry about her becoming a hermit." The conversation was performing itself now. Jessica center stage with me as the unwilling supporting character. David nodded sagely as if my social life was a matter of great concern to him. Other guests began to orbit our little cluster, drawn by the scent of entertainment disguised as family concern. I've been thinking, Jessica continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was about to solve everyone's problems. Maybe it's time you considered something more stable. David's firm always needs reliable people for clerical work. The pay isn't much, but it's better than serving coffee to strangers. The offer hung in the air like charity, wrapped in the kind of kindness that felt more like condescension. I could see the nods of approval from the gathered audience, the murmurs of what a generous sister Jessica was being. They were all waiting for my gratitude, for me to recognize this moment as the rescue I supposedly needed. That's very thoughtful, I said carefully, but I'm happy where I am. Jessica's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way it did when things didn't go according to her script. Sweetheart, you can't serve coffee forever. What about your future? What about retirement? You're 28 years old with no real savings, no benefits, no security. The conversation was becoming a public intervention now, with Jessica as the concerned sister and me as the project that needed fixing. I could feel the weight of their collective assumption that my life was somehow incomplete, that I was struggling in ways I was too proud to admit. The country club's ambient lighting seemed to dim around the edges, focusing the spotlight on my supposed inadequacy. Money isn't everything, I said quietly, but Jessica was already shaking her head. Easy to say when you don't have any. Her laugh was light, but her eyes were sharp. Sarah, I love you, but you live in a fantasy world. That little apartment of yours, that old car, shopping at thrift stores like it's a choice rather than a necessity. We've all been there, but most of us grow out of it. David cleared his throat, entering the conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. Sarah, Jessica's just looking out for you. We all are. There's no shame in accepting help from family. The word help landed like a weight in my chest. Help implied need, implied failure, implied that my choices were actually just circumstances I was too stubborn to acknowledge. Around us, the party continued with its careful orchestration of success and satisfaction, but our little corner had become a stage for my supposed rehabilitation. Amanda touched my arm with practiced sympathy. We just want to see you happy, Sarah. Really happy, not just pretending to be content with less than you deserve. Less than I deserve. The phrase
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Echoed in my mind as I looked around at their faces, each one arranged in an expression of concern that felt more like judgment. They had decided, collectively and without consultation, that my life was insufficient, that my contentment was delusion, that my choices were actually just limitations I had learned to accept. I appreciate your concern, I began, but Jessica was already moving to her closing argument. Look, I know you're proud, I know you want to figure things out on your own, but pride doesn't pay rent, Sarah. Pride doesn't build a future. She paused, letting her words settle like dust in sunlight. We're family. Let us help you before it's too late. Before it's too late. The words suggested urgency, a crisis that only they could see, a disaster that only their intervention could prevent. I stood there surrounded by crystal and marble, by designer clothes and practiced smiles, feeling like an exhibit in a museum of good intentions. The moment stretched like elastic, everyone waiting for my response, for my capitulation, for my grateful acceptance of their version of my reality. Instead, I set my club soda down on the nearest surface and reached for my small purse, the kind that held exactly what it needed to hold and nothing more. Jessica, I said, my voice carrying a clarity that surprised even me, what if I told you that everything you think you know about my situation is wrong? Her smile faltered just slightly, the first crack in her certainty. What do you mean? I looked around at their faces, at the gathering crowd of witnesses to what they thought would be my moment of grateful surrender. What if I told you that the person you've been trying to save has been protecting something you never even knew existed? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and mysterious. David's lawyer instincts seemed to activate, his posture shifting slightly as if he sensed a change in the courtroom dynamic. Amanda's expression moved from sympathy to curiosity. Jessica's confidence wavered like a candle in wind. Sarah, what are you talking about? Jessica's voice carried a note I had never heard before, something that might have been uncertainty. I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card, cream-colored with elegant lettering, Sterling and Associates Wealth Management. I placed it on the high-top table beside my abandoned drink, the small rectangle of paper somehow commanding attention in the space between us. 3 years ago, when I turned 25, I received a certified letter from this company. I let my finger rest on the card's edge. They had been trying to reach me for months. The party seemed to continue around us, but our little cluster had gone quiet. Jessica picked up the card, her eyes scanning the expensive printing, the downtown address, the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money. A wealth management company wanted to reach you. David's legal training made him the first to ask the obvious question, though his tone suggested he was still expecting a punchline. Not wanted to reach me. Needed to reach me. I paused, letting the distinction sink in. There was something that belonged to me, something I never knew existed. Jessica was staring at the card like it might dissolve in her hands. Sarah, this doesn't make sense. Wealth management companies don't just randomly contact people who work at coffee shops. You're right, I agreed. They don't contact people randomly. They contact people who have wealth to manage. The words dropped into the conversation like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the group. Amanda's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. David's eyebrows drew together in the way they did when he encountered an unexpected legal precedent. Jessica's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. That's impossible, Jessica finally managed. Sarah, you live in a one-bedroom apartment. You drive a car that's older than some of my shoes. You count quarters for laundry money. Do I asked gently. Or is that what you assumed? The question sat between us like a puzzle with missing pieces. I could see them trying to recalculate, trying to make the math work, trying to reconcile the Sarah they thought they knew with the possibility of something they had never considered. Our grandmother, I continued, my voice steady and quiet, set up a trust fund when I was 5 years old. It was designed to activate when I turned 25, provided I had demonstrated independence and self-reliance. Jessica's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. That's not possible. Grandma Nana left everything equally between us. The lawyers said so. She left her estate equally between you and Dad. The trust fund was separate, private, managed by a different firm entirely. I picked up my purse, the weight of it suddenly feeling different in my hands. Sterling and Associates has been managing my portfolio for 3 years now. I've been meeting with Michael Chen, my wealth manager, every quarter to review performance and discuss investment strategies. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause. This wasn't anticipation or confusion. This was the sound of worldviews shifting, of assumptions crumbling, of certainties becoming questions. David found his voice first, his legal mind grabbing onto process and procedure. Sarah, if this is true, if there really is a trust fund, how much are we talking about? I looked around at their faces, at the country club setting that had felt so imposing when I walked in, at the crystal and marble that had seemed to represent a world I couldn't access. Now it all looked smaller somehow, more fragile, less significant. As of last week's statement, I said quietly, $45 million. The number landed like a thunderclap in our small circle. Amanda's wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire club. Jessica's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the way the blood drained from her face. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. For a moment, the only sound was the tinkling of glass being swept up by efficient staff, the party continuing around us, while our little world reorganized itself around this new reality. $45 million. The number hung in the air like a small sun, impossible to ignore, changing the light by which everything else was seen. That's not possible, Jessica whispered, but her voice lacked conviction now. Sarah, if you had $45 million, why would you work at a coffee shop? Why would you live the way you do? The question revealed everything about how she understood the world, how she believed money should behave, how she thought wealth should announce itself. I looked at her standing there in her designer dress at her expensive anniversary party, surrounded by the symbols of success she thought mattered, and I felt something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite satisfaction either. Because, I said gently, Nana's letter made it very clear. The money was there if I needed it, but only after I had proven I could build a life worth living without it. She wanted me to choose who I was before I chose what I wanted. The revelation hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. I could see Jessica trying to process this information, trying to reconcile 3 years of pitying me with the possibility that I had been sitting on a fortune the entire time. The mathematics of our relationship suddenly looked very different. So every time we offered to help, David said slowly, his lawyer's mind working through the implications, every time we worried about your future, every time you called my life choices naive or my contentment delusion, I finished quietly, I was choosing to live simply because I could afford to live any way I wanted. The party swirled around us, crystal and laughter and the careful choreography of social success, but our conversation had become something else entirely. It had become a reckoning, a moment when years of assumptions met an undeniable new reality, and I stood at the center of it, no longer the family member who needed saving, but the one who had been quietly, deliberately, authentically free all along. Part 2. The Philosophy of Hidden Wealth. The shock on their faces told me everything I needed to know about how they saw the world. Money to them was performance. It was designer labels and expensive cars, country club memberships and public displays of affluence. The idea that someone could possess extraordinary wealth and choose to live quietly was as foreign to them as speaking in tongues. They couldn't comprehend that I had been rich in the truest sense all along, rich enough not to care about appearing rich. I had learned something in those 3 years since Michael Chen first called me that most people never discover. Real wealth isn't about what you own, or how you spend, it's about having so many options that you can choose the ones that actually matter to you. I worked at Brewster's Coffee House not because I had to, but because I loved the ritual of morning conversations with regulars, the satisfaction of crafting the perfect espresso, the way Mrs. Henderson always lit up when I remembered her usual order of decaf with extra foam and a dash of cinnamon. The apartment in Maple Grove wasn't a compromise forced by financial constraints, it was a deliberate choice. I had looked at penthouses and luxury condos, toured mansions with circular driveways and staff quarters. But there was something pure about my small space with its single bedroom and kitchen window that faced east. Every morning, sunlight streamed through those windows and hit my coffee mug just right, creating patterns on the wall that no amount of money could improve upon. That moment of perfect contentment, that daily reminder that happiness lived in details rather than square footage, was worth more to me than any showcase home. My old Honda Civic had been a gift from my father when I graduated high school, back when he still believed I might amount to something conventional. I could have replaced it 100 times over with luxury vehicles that announced my worth to every passing stranger. Instead, I maintained it carefully, took it to Eddie's garage downtown, where he knew every bolt and gasket by heart. There was honesty in that relationship, in Eddie's straightforward assessments and fair prices, in the way he never tried to sell me services I didn't need. Compare that to the luxury dealerships where salespeople calculated your net worth with their eyes and adjusted their pitch accordingly. But perhaps the deepest truth was that I had spent 3 years learning who I was without the weight of other people's expectations. Every day that I chose simplicity over spectacle, every moment I found joy in ordinary pleasures, every time I helped a customer find exactly what they needed rather than what would profit me most, I was building something more valuable than any investment portfolio. I was building character that couldn't be bought, borrowed, or inherited. The trust fund that grandmother Nana had established wasn't just money sitting in accounts waiting for me to claim it. It was a test, a challenge, a gift wrapped in patience and wisdom. She had watched her own children, including my father, struggle with the corrupting influence of easy wealth. She had seen how money could twist relationships, turn love into leverage, make every kindness suspect, so she created something different for me, something that would only activate after I had proven I could find meaning without it. Michael Chen had explained this to me during our first meeting, reading from Nana's detailed instructions with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. She had specified that I needed to demonstrate 3 years of financial independence, living within my means, building genuine relationships, pursuing education or work that fulfilled me rather than simply enriched me. Only then would the full truth be revealed. Only then would I have access to wealth that couldn't corrupt what I had already built. Standing there in the country club, watching my family process the impossible mathematics of my situation, I understood why Nana had been so careful, so specific, so protective. Jessica's entire identity was constructed around financial superiority. She had married David not just for love, but for the lifestyle his law practice provided. She chose friends based on their ability to enhance her social standing, selected activities that would photograph well, made decisions that would impress rather than fulfill. The idea that her younger sister, the one she had been patronizing for years, possessed wealth that dwarfed her own threatened the very foundation of who she thought she was. David's confusion ran even deeper. As a lawyer, he was accustomed to being the smartest person in any financial discussion. He advised clients on estate planning, helped structure deals worth millions, understood the language of wealth in ways most people never would. Yet here was a situation that had operated completely outside his expertise. A family member who had been managing a fortune while he offered her entry-level job opportunities at his firm. The reversal wasn't just surprising, it was professionally embarrassing. Amanda's reaction was perhaps the most honest. Her entire career as an interior designer depended on reading people's financial situations accurately. She prided herself on knowing who could afford her services, who was stretching their budget for appearances, who truly belonged in the circles she moved through. My revelation didn't just shock her, it exposed a fundamental flaw in her professional instincts. She had been dismissing a potential client worth $45 million as someone too poor to matter. The country club setting made the irony even sharper. This institution, with its membership fees and dress codes and unspoken hierarchies, represented everything they thought I could never access. Yet I could have bought the entire club without straining my investment portfolio. I could have joined as a member, sponsored events, influenced policies, commanded respect through sheer financial weight. Instead, I had chosen to stand at the edges of their world, observing rather than participating, learning rather than performing. But the most profound realization was about family itself. For years they had positioned themselves as my benefactors, the successful relatives who would eventually rescue me from my apparent limitations. Every offer of help, every suggestion for improvement, every expression of concern had been predicated on the assumption that I needed them more than they needed me. Now suddenly, that equation was reversed in ways that made every past interaction look different. I thought about all the times Jessica had paid for dinner with a flourish, making sure everyone noticed her generosity. All the times David had offered legal advice with the air of someone doing charity work. All the times Amanda had included me in social events like a sympathy invitation. Each gesture of supposed kindness now revealed itself as performance, as a way to maintain their sense of superiority, while appearing magnanimous. The $45 million wasn't just money, it was freedom from their version of my story. For 3 years, I had been living proof that their definitions of success were incomplete, that their measurements of worth were inadequate, that their understanding of happiness was limited. I had been showing them, without saying a word, that contentment could exist without their approval, that meaning could be found outside their parameters, that strength could manifest as simplicity rather than spectacle. Now they had to confront the possibility that the person they had been trying to save was actually the one who had been free all along. The person they had been offering opportunities to was actually the one with the most options. The person they had been worried about was actually the one with the most security. It was a reversal so complete that it didn't just change our relationship, it challenged their fundamental understanding of how the world worked. Part 3. The Gathering Storm. The country club's ambient noise seemed to fade around our stunned little group. Conversations from nearby tables became distant murmurs. The clink of silverware against fine china turned into background percussion, and even the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers felt muted. The $45 million revelation hung in the air like smoke, changing the atmosphere of everything it touched. Jessica recovered first, but her recovery looked more like someone surfacing from deep water, gasping and disoriented. Sarah, this is insane. If what you're saying is true, if you really have access to that kind of
money, then why? Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Why let us worry about you? Why let us think you were struggling? Why put us through all of this concern? The question revealed so much about how she experienced the world. To Jessica, my choice to live simply while possessing wealth was not just incomprehensible, it was cruel. In her mind, I had been deceiving them, allowing them to waste emotional energy on unnecessary worry, letting them play roles in a drama where the script was fundamentally false. She couldn't see it as a test of their love or a proof of my independence. She could only see it as a betrayal of their assumptions. Put you through what exactly? I asked gently. I never asked for your concern. I never requested your help. I never complained about my situation or suggested I was unhappy with my choices. David stepped forward, his lawyer instincts engaged now, his tone shifting from social conversation to something resembling cross-examination. But Sarah, you had to know how it looked. You had to understand that family members would naturally worry about someone living so far below their potential. Below their potential. The phrase hung there like a judgment, revealing how they had categorized every aspect of my existence. My apartment wasn't a home I had chosen. It was evidence of limited ambition. My job wasn't work that fulfilled me. It was a placeholder until I figured out something better. My contentment wasn't genuine happiness. It was resignation disguised as acceptance. What if, I said, looking directly at David, my potential isn't measured by the same metrics you use? What if success, for me, isn't about accumulating symbols of wealth, but about living authentically regardless of what others think? Amanda's nervous laugh cut through the tension like a blade. Sarah, that's very philosophical, but you can't tell me you don't see the irony here. All this time we've been feeling sorry for you, including you in things out of kindness, making sure you didn't feel left out, because we thought you couldn't afford to participate fully. The admission was more honest than she probably intended. It confirmed what I had suspected for years. My inclusion in family events wasn't based on love or genuine desire for my company. It was based on pity, on their perception of me as someone who needed their charity to access experiences I couldn't otherwise afford. Every invitation, every paid dinner, every gesture of inclusion had been tainted by their assumption of my inadequacy. So you're angry, I said, carefully, not because I kept a secret, but because your pity was misplaced. Jessica's face flushed, the elegant composure she had maintained all evening beginning to crack. That's not fair, Sarah. We love you. We've always included you, always made sure you felt part of the family, even when, she paused, catching herself before finishing the sentence, but the implication hung in the air anyway. Even when what? I pressed gently. Even when you thought I was a disappointment. Even when you believed I had failed to live up to the family's standards.
even when you saw me as someone who needed to be managed rather than simply accepted. The country club's carefully orchestrated atmosphere of success and celebration formed a stark backdrop to our unfolding family drama. Other guests continued their conversations about vacation homes and private schools, about investment portfolios and charitable galas, about all the markers of achievement that my family had assumed were beyond my reach. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could have participated in any of those conversations from a position of actual expertise, rather than pretended interest. David cleared his throat, attempting to restore some semblance of rational discussion to what was becoming an emotional minefield. Sarah, let's assume everything you're saying is accurate. Let's assume there really is a trust fund worth $45 million. The question now is what you plan to do with this information, with this resource. The question was careful, calculated, the kind attorneys ask when they're fishing for information that might be useful later. But it also revealed David's inability to understand that the money itself wasn't the point. He was already thinking about investment strategies, tax implications, estate planning opportunities. He couldn't conceive that someone might possess extraordinary wealth and not center their entire life around maximizing it. I plan to continue doing exactly what I've been doing, I said simply, working at Brewster's Coffee House, living in my apartment, driving my Honda, making choices based on what brings me satisfaction, rather than what impresses other people. Amanda's perfectly crafted expression cracked entirely. You're going to keep serving coffee. Sarah, do you understand what $45 million means? You could travel anywhere, buy anything, do whatever you want. You could have the life we all thought you deserved, but couldn't access. The life you all thought I deserved. The phrase revealed the core of their confusion. They had constructed an elaborate narrative about my limitations, my struggles, my need for rescue. In that narrative, I was a victim of circumstances who would naturally embrace luxury and status if only I had the opportunity, the possibility that I might genuinely prefer simplicity, that I might find authentic happiness in ordinary pleasures, that I might choose contentment over consumption, was literally incomprehensible to them. Jessica's voice took on the tone she used when explaining obvious things to slow children. Sarah, sweetheart, I think you're in shock. This is overwhelming news. Maybe we should call Michael Chen tomorrow, verify the details, help you understand your options. Clearly you need time to process what this means for your future. The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. Even faced with evidence that I possessed wealth that dwarfed their own, even confronted with proof that I had been making deliberate choices rather than accepting limitations, she still couldn't abandon her position as the older, wiser sister who knew what was best for me. In her mind, my response to sudden wealth should mirror her own values. Immediate lifestyle elevation, status symbol acquisition, social climbing acceleration. I've had 3 years to process this, Jessica. 3 years of quarterly meetings with wealth managers, 3 years of watching my portfolio grow, 3 years of choosing how to live with knowledge you're just now discovering. My voice remained calm, but something steelier had entered it. What I'm processing now is how quickly your concern for my well-being transforms into instructions about how I should manage my life. The observation hit its target. Jessica's face went through several expressions, rapid succession: surprise, denial, anger, and something that might have been recognition. For just a moment, the mask of concerned older sister slipped, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. David's legal training kicked in again, his tone becoming more formal. Sarah, obviously this is family business, but I feel obligated to point out that sudden access to substantial wealth can create various complications: tax implications, investment decisions, estate planning considerations. You might benefit from professional guidance beyond whatever you're getting from Sterling and Associates. The offer of help came wrapped in the same assumptions that had governed all their previous offers:
David couldn't conceive that I might already have access to better financial advice than he could provide, that my wealth management team might include experts whose credentials exceeded his own, that my financial planning might already be more sophisticated than anything his law practice typically handled. Even now, even knowing the numbers, he positioned himself as the professional who could guide the amateur through complex territory. "David," I said quietly, "Sterling and Associates manages portfolios for people whose net worth starts where yours ends. Michael Chen has an MBA from Wharton and 20 years of experience with ultra-high net worth clients. My tax attorney graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law and specializes in complex trust structures. My financial planning is already more comprehensive than most people will ever need." The information landed like a series of small explosions. David's expression shifted from condescending helpfulness to something approaching professional jealousy. He was accustomed to being the most qualified person in any financial discussion, the one others turned to for expertise and guidance. Learning that his sister-in-law had access to legal and financial resources that surpassed his own wasn't just surprising, it was professionally humbling in ways that went beyond simple family dynamics. The party continued around us, but our little cluster had become an island of tension in an ocean of celebration. Other guests occasionally glanced in our direction, perhaps sensing drama, but unable to identify its source. The beautiful people in their beautiful clothes continued their beautiful conversations, unaware that the fundamental dynamics of one family were reshaping themselves in real time just a few feet away. I looked around at their faces, at the confusion and resentment and wounded pride that my revelation had created, and I felt something shift inside me. For 3 years, I had been content to let them maintain their illusions about my life, to accept their pity and condescension as the price of family harmony. I had told myself that their limitations were not my responsibility, that their need to feel superior was not my problem to solve. But standing there in that moment, watching them struggle to reconcile their assumptions with reality, I realized that my silence hadn't been kindness. It had been complicity. By allowing them to patronize me, by accepting their charity and concern without correction, I had enabled them to construct false narratives, not just about my life, but about their own generosity and wisdom. My gentleness had protected their delusions at the expense of authentic relationship. The $45 million wasn't just money, it was truth, and truth had a weight that changed everything it touched. There was no going back to the comfortable fiction that I was the family member who needed saving, the one whose struggles justified their success, the one whose limitations made their achievements seem more significant by comparison. For the first time in 3 years, I felt the full power of the choice that Grandmother Nana had given me, not just the choice of how to spend wealth, but the choice of how to use truth. And standing there in that country club, surrounded by crystal and marble and the careful choreography of social status, I decided it was time to use it fully. Part 4. The comfortable lies we tell. The silence that followed my revelation about my legal and financial team stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. I could see each of them processing the information, trying to fit this new reality into the comfortable categories they had used to organize their understanding of our family hierarchy. Jessica's fingers worried the stem of her champagne flute, while David stared at me like I was a legal precedent he couldn't quite classify. Amanda had gone very still, the kind of stillness that suggests someone is recalculating everything they thought they knew, but it was my father's approach that changed the entire dynamic of the evening. Bob Thompson moved through the country club crowd with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to solving problems through direct conversation. He had been watching our little group from across the room, and whatever he had observed in our body language had triggered his parental intervention instincts. His insurance manager training had taught him to recognize when situations were escalating beyond casual social friction. "Everything all right over here?" His voice carried the forced casualness of someone trying to diffuse tension without acknowledging its existence.
Sarah, you look a little overwhelmed. Maybe you'd like to step outside for some air. The suggestion was classic Bob Thompson: identify the problem person, remove them from the situation, restore normal social functioning. In his mind, I was clearly the unstable element in an otherwise perfectly pleasant family gathering. The idea that I might be the one revealing uncomfortable truths, rather than creating unnecessary drama, was outside his conceptual framework. Jessica seized on her father's arrival like a lifeline. Dad, Sarah's been telling us about some trust fund situation. It's all very confusing, and I think she might be a little mixed up about the details. The phrase "mixed up about the details" was perfectly chosen. It suggested that I was suffering from some combination of wishful thinking and poor information, rather than delivering factual revelations that threatened their worldview. It positioned Jessica as the concerned family member, trying to protect everyone from my delusions, rather than as someone whose assumptions were being systematically demolished. Bob's expression shifted into the patient tolerance he had always shown when I disappointed him with impractical ideas or unrealistic ambitions. Sarah, honey, I think there might be some misunderstanding about your grandmother's estate. We went through all the paperwork very carefully when she passed. Everything was distributed according to her will. His certainty was absolute and completely wrong, but it revealed something important about how he had always processed information that didn't fit his preferences. When grandmother Nana was alive, she had tried several times to explain her financial arrangements to him, to hint at the separate provisions she was making for my future. But Bob had the kind of selective attention that filtered out information he found inconvenient or uncomfortable. He heard what confirmed his existing beliefs and dismissed what challenged them. Dad, I said gently, the trust fund was never part of Nana's estate. It was established separately, managed by different attorneys, designed to operate independently of any probate proceedings. His expression didn't change, which told me everything I needed to know about his capacity for processing information that contradicted his established understanding. Bob Thompson had spent 25 years in insurance, a profession that rewarded skepticism and careful risk assessment, but his professional skills seemed to abandon him when it came to family situations that might require him to admit he had been wrong about something important. Sarah, I think you might have been contacted by some kind of scam operation. These people prey on family members after deaths, especially when there's been any kind of inheritance. They convince you there's hidden money, get you to pay fees for processing, then disappear with whatever they can steal. His voice carried the authority of someone explaining obvious fraud to a naive victim. The explanation was so reasonable, so protective, so completely wrong, that it actually impressed me. Bob had managed to construct a narrative that preserved his certainty while casting me as someone who needed rescue from my own gullibility. In his version of events, I wasn't revealing hidden wealth, I was being victimized by sophisticated criminals who exploited grief and hope for financial gain. David's legal training made him more curious about the practical details. Sarah, if there really is a trust fund, there would have to be documentation. Original trust agreements, tax filings, beneficiary notifications. These things create paper trails that can be verified. The challenge was fair and professional, the kind of request any competent attorney would make when confronted with extraordinary financial claims. But it also revealed David's assumption that I was operating from emotion rather than evidence, that my assertions were wishful thinking rather than carefully verified facts. I reached into my purse again, this time withdrawing a slim leather portfolio that I had carried to every quarterly meeting with Michael Chen. Inside were copies of every document David had mentioned, the original trust agreement with Nana's signature, the beneficiary notification letter that had been sent to me 3 years earlier, the most recent tax filings showing $45 million in managed assets, the quarterly performance reports that tracked every gain and distribution. These are copies, I said, placing the portfolio on the high-top table where everyone could see it. The originals are in Sterling and Associates vault, but these are certified copies that should answer most of your questions about documentation. Jessica reached for the portfolio first, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the leather cover. Her eyes scanned the first document, the trust agreement that bore both Nana's signature and the notarization that made it legally binding. I watched her face change as she processed the language, the dates, the financial figures that appeared throughout the text. This says the trust was established 12 years ago, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the country club's ambient noise. Sarah, you would have been 16. Why didn't anyone tell us? The question revealed the depth of her confusion. Jessica had always assumed that family financial matters were collective business, that significant decisions would be discussed and debated among all the adults involved. The idea that grandmother Nana might have made private arrangements, might have chosen to keep certain plans confidential, might have had reasons for limiting who knew about her intentions, was genuinely shocking to her. Bob took the portfolio from Jessica's hands, his insurance background making him more systematic about reviewing financial documents. But as he read through the trust agreement, the beneficiary notifications, the performance reports that showed consistent growth over multiple years, his expression began to change. The confident dismissal faded, replaced by something that looked like confusion tinged with anger. Helen never mentioned any of this to me, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of betrayal. She told me everything was being handled through the estate attorney, that all her financial arrangements were straightforward and transparent. The hurt in his voice was real and deep. Bob had always prided himself on being the responsible son, the one who helped his mother with financial decisions, the one she turned to for advice about investments and insurance and retirement planning. Learning that she had made arrangements worth tens of millions of dollars without consulting him wasn't just surprising, it was a fundamental challenge to his understanding of their relationship. Amanda leaned over David's shoulder as he examined the quarterly performance reports. These numbers, she said slowly, they're not just talking about the principal amount, they're showing growth, distributions, reinvestments. This portfolio has been actively managed for years. Her observation was accurate and important. The documents didn't just prove that a trust fund existed, they demonstrated that it had been professionally managed, that it had grown substantially since its creation, that I had been receiving regular reports and updates about its performance. This wasn't money sitting dormant in some forgotten account. This was a sophisticated financial instrument that required ongoing attention and expertise. David's expression had shifted from skeptical to professionally impressed. As someone who worked with wealthy clients, he recognized the quality of the documentation, the sophistication of the investment strategies, the level of legal and financial expertise that had gone into structuring the trust. This wasn't amateur hour financial planning, this was the kind of comprehensive wealth management that only the truly affluent could access. Sarah, he said carefully, I have to ask. If you've known about this for 3 years, if you've been meeting with wealth managers and tax attorneys, if you've been watching this portfolio grow to $45 million, why continue working at a coffee shop? Why maintain a lifestyle that suggests financial constraint? The question was the heart of their confusion, the puzzle piece that didn't fit their understanding of how rational people behaved. To them, wealth was a tool for purchasing status, comfort, and social position. The idea that someone might possess extraordinary financial resources and choose not to use them for lifestyle elevation was as incomprehensible as choosing to walk when you owned a luxury car. Because, I said, looking around at their faces, at the mixture of confusion and resentment and wounded pride that my revelations had created, I wanted to learn who I was before I learned what I could buy. I wanted to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than financial attraction. I wanted to discover what brought me authentic satisfaction rather than what impressed other people. The explanation hung in the air between us, simple and complex at the same time, simple because it described a straightforward desire for authenticity, complex because it challenged every assumption they had made about motivation, success, and the proper relationship between wealth and identity. Jessica closed the portfolio slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. "So all this time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when we were worried about your future, when we were trying to help you find better opportunities, when we were including you in things, because we thought you couldn't afford them otherwise, you were actually wealthier than all of us combined." The statement wasn't a question, but it carried the weight of someone trying to process a fundamental reversal of everything she had believed about our family dynamics. For years, she had positioned herself as the successful sister, the one who had figured out how to navigate adult responsibilities, the one whose lifestyle represented achievement and security. Now she had to confront the possibility that her younger sister, the one she had been patronizing and pitying, actually possessed resources that made her own accomplishments look modest by comparison. The country club setting, with its careful displays of affluence and status, suddenly felt different around us. The crystal glasses and marble surfaces, the designer clothing and expensive jewelry, all the symbols of success that had seemed so significant when I walked in now appeared smaller, more fragile, less impressive. Not because they lacked value, but because I now understood that I could afford any of them without strain, that my choice to live differently had been exactly that, a choice rather than a limitation. But perhaps the most significant shift was in how I saw myself in relation to their expectations. For 3 years, I had been content to let them maintain their illusions, to accept their condescension as the price of family harmony. I had told myself that their need to feel superior wasn't my responsibility to challenge, that their assumptions about my limitations weren't my burden to correct. Now I understood that my silence hadn't been kindness, it had been a form of deception that served no one's best interests. By allowing them to patronize me, by accepting their charity, without revealing my true circumstances, I had enabled them to construct false narratives about both my life and their own generosity. I had protected their delusions at the expense of authentic relationship. Standing there in that moment, surrounded by the debris of their shattered assumptions, I realized that the $45 million was about to become the least important part of this story. The real revelation wasn't about money at all, it was about truth, and how the absence of truth had shaped every interaction we'd had for years. The comfortable lies we tell ourselves about other people's lives, about our own superiority, about the reasons we offer help or express concern, were about to be examined in ways that none of us had expected when the evening began, and I was no longer willing to be complicit in maintaining
those lies, regardless of what their exposure might cost any of us. Part 5. When assumptions crumble. The weight of revelation settled over our small group like dust after demolition. I could see each family member struggling to reorganize their understanding of the past 3 years, trying to reconcile the Sarah they thought they knew with the Sarah who had just dismantled every assumption they'd held about my life. The country club buzzed with its usual symphony of success and celebration around us, but our corner had become something else entirely, a surgical suite where comfortable illusions were being methodically removed. Jessica set down her champagne glass with the careful precision of someone whose hands weren't entirely steady. "I need to understand something," she said, her voice carrying a control that seemed to require tremendous effort. "When you said you were happy with your choices, when you told us you didn't need help, when you acted like our concern was unnecessary, you knew you had access to more money than any of us had ever seen." The accusation hung between us like a blade. In Jessica's mind, I had committed a fundamental betrayal by allowing them to worry about me when worry was unnecessary, by accepting their pity when pity was misplaced, by letting them feel superior when superiority was an illusion. She couldn't see my choice to live simply as authentic preference, she could only see it as elaborate deception designed to make them look foolish. I knew I had access to financial security, I corrected gently, but knowing you have money and needing to use it are different things. I was genuinely happy with my life, genuinely satisfied with my choices, genuinely content with what I had built.
The trust fund didn't change those facts, it just meant I had chosen my circumstances rather than having them imposed on me. David leaned forward, his legal training engaged now in a way that went beyond casual family conversation. Sarah, you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. We've spent years making decisions based on what we believe to be your financial situation. Jessica has paid for family dinners. Dad has offered to help with your car repairs. I've mentioned job opportunities at my firm. We've all shaped our behavior around the assumption that you needed support. We were in a position to provide. The indictment was carefully constructed and completely accurate. They had indeed made decisions based on false information, had offered help I didn't need, had positioned themselves as benefactors to someone who possessed resources that dwarfed their own. But David's framing revealed something important about how he understood relationships as transactions based on accurate assessment of relative need and capacity. And how does it feel, I asked quietly, to discover that your generosity was based on assumptions rather than requests? That your help was offered to someone who never asked for it, that your sense of superiority was built on information you never bothered to verify. The questions landed like individual weights, each one adding to the pressure that was building in our small circle. Bob shifted uncomfortably, his insurance background making him recognize when risk assessment had gone fundamentally wrong. Amanda's perfectly composed expression began to crack around the edges, revealing something raw or underneath. Sarah, that's not fair, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. You can't blame us for making reasonable assumptions based on observable evidence. You work at a coffee shop, live in a modest apartment, drive an old car, shop at thrift stores. What were we supposed to think? The defense was logical and revealed everything about how she processed information about other people's lives. Jessica operated from a worldview where external circumstances reliably indicated internal realities, where lifestyle choices accurately reflected financial constraints, where appearance provided trustworthy data about capability and need. The possibility that someone might deliberately choose simplicity, might prefer contentment to consumption, might find authentic satisfaction in ordinary pleasures was outside her conceptual framework. You were supposed to think whatever you wanted, I replied, but you weren't supposed to act on those assumptions without asking me directly whether I needed or wanted your help. You were supposed to recognize that your observations might be incomplete, that your interpretations might be influenced by your own values and priorities, that your conclusions might say more about your limitations than mine. Amanda finally found her voice, though it came out sharper than her usual carefully modulated tone. So what was this, Sarah? Some kind of test, some elaborate psychological experiment to see how long you could fool us? Some way to prove that we're all shallow materialists who only value people based on their apparent wealth? The accusation cut closer to truth than she probably intended. There had been something experimental about my choice to remain silent, something that resembled testing in the way I had observed their behavior while withholding information that would have changed it. But calling it a test suggested deliberate manipulation, conscious deception designed to trap them in revealing their true natures. It wasn't a test, I said carefully. It was a choice to let you know me as I actually am rather than as what my bank account might suggest I could become. It was a decision to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than financial calculation. It was an opportunity to discover whether your love for me was dependent on your perception of my need for your help. Bob's face had gone through several expressions during our exchange, settling finally on something that looked like wounded anger. Sarah, you're talking like we only cared about you because we thought you were struggling. That's not true. And it's not fair. We love you regardless of your financial situation. The protest sounded sincere, but it carried an undertone of uncertainty that suggested Bob wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. For 3 years, his relationship with me had been shaped by his perception that I was the child who hadn't quite figured out how to be successful, who needed guidance and occasional rescue, who represented both disappointment and opportunity for redemption through parental intervention. Then why, I asked gently, Does learning about my financial security make you angry rather than happy? Why does discovering that I don't need your help feel like betrayal rather than relief? Why does finding out that I chose my lifestyle rather than having it forced on me seem to diminish rather than enhance your love for me? The questions hung in the country club air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Around us, other families continued their celebrations, their conversations about vacation plans and investment strategies, their comfortable exchanges based on shared assumptions about success and status. But our little group had become something different, a laboratory where the chemistry of family dynamics was being analyzed under conditions none of us had expected. Jessica's composure finally cracked entirely. Because it makes us look like idiots, Sarah. It makes every conversation we've had, every offer we've made, every moment of concern we've expressed look patronizing and stupid. It makes us look like we were talking down to someone who was actually above us the entire time. Part 6. The intervention that wasn't Jessica's raw admission about looking like idiots hung in the air between us like a confession she immediately regretted making. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck, and for the first time all evening her composure had completely abandoned her. The country club's elegant atmosphere seemed to mock our family drama, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light over what had become an emotional battlefield disguised as a social gathering. You want to know what the worst part is? Jessica continued, her voice gaining momentum like a car rolling downhill. It's not even the money, Sarah, it's that you sat there and watched us make fools of ourselves. You let me pay for your birthday dinner last month, knowing you could have bought the entire restaurant. You let David offer you job opportunities at his firm, knowing you probably have more money in your checking account than he makes in a year. You let all of us worry about your future while you had more financial security than we'll ever see. Each example she cited felt like a small knife, precisely aimed at the moments when their assumptions had been most exposed, when their condescension had been most apparent, when their need to feel superior had been most transparent. I could see her mentally cataloging every interaction over the past 3 years, reframing each instance of supposed generosity as evidence of manipulation on my part. Bob stepped closer, his insurance manager training making him focus on the practical implications rather than the emotional ones. Sarah, if you've had access to this money for 3 years, there are tax consequences we need to consider. Gift tax issues from when we've helped you financially, estate planning complications, investment income reporting requirements. This affects more than just family dynamics. His concern was genuine but revealed his inability to separate emotional relationships from financial transactions. In Bob's mind, discovering my wealth didn't just change our family story, it created legal and financial complications that needed immediate professional attention. He couldn't process the revelation without immediately jumping to risk management and damage control. Amanda had been uncharacteristically quiet during Jessica's outburst, but now she spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing her words like surgical instruments. What I don't understand, Sarah, is why you would put yourself through this. Why work 40 hours a week at a coffee shop when you don't have to? Why live in a small apartment when you could afford anything? Why drive an old car? Why shop at thrift stores? Why limit yourself in ways that seem completely unnecessary? The questions revealed Amanda's fundamental inability to comprehend that someone might choose simplicity over luxury, might prefer authenticity over appearance, might find genuine satisfaction in ordinary experiences that couldn't be purchased or upgraded. Her entire professional identity as an interior designer was built on the assumption that people with means naturally wanted to display them, that financial capacity should translate directly into lifestyle enhancement. Because, I said, looking around at their faces, I wanted to learn who I was when no one was trying to impress me, influence me, or use me. I wanted to build relationships with people who valued me for my character rather than my connections. I wanted to discover what brought me joy rather than what brought me status. David shook his head, his legal training making him focus on precedent and process. Sarah, That's a luxury most people can't afford. The luxury of choosing poverty, of playing at being working class, of experimenting with limitation while knowing you have an escape route. Do you realize how privileged that sounds to people who actually struggle with financial constraint? The criticism was sharp and well aimed. David had identified something that had troubled me during my 3 years of chosen simplicity, the knowledge that my circumstances were voluntary rather than imposed, that my modest lifestyle was a philosophical choice rather than an economic necessity, that I could end my experiment in contentment whenever I chose to access my resources. You're right, I acknowledged. Having the safety net of wealth while choosing to live modestly is a form of privilege. But it's also the only way I could learn whether my happiness was dependent on external circumstances or internal choices. It's the only way I could discover whether I was capable of building a meaningful life without using money as a shortcut. Jessica's anger was building rather than diminishing, fed by what she perceived as my philosophical pretensions and moral superiority. Don't lecture us about meaningful lives, Sarah. We've all worked hard for what we have. We've all made sacrifices, taken risks, built careers and relationships and families. Just because we didn't have the luxury of a secret trust fund doesn't mean our lives are less authentic or meaningful than yours. The accusation stung because it contained elements of truth wrapped in defensiveness and resentment. Jessica had indeed worked hard, had built a successful career in marketing, had navigated the complexities of marriage and social expectations. But her anger revealed something else, the fear that my revelation somehow diminished her achievements, made her struggles seem less significant, called into question the value of everything she had accomplished. I never said your lives were less meaningful, I replied gently. But I did discover that your assumptions about my life were completely wrong, and that your need to feel superior to me was based on information you never bothered to verify. Bob's face darkened at what he perceived as an attack on the family's collective integrity. Sarah, that's enough. We're your family, we've loved you, supported you, included you in everything we do. If we made assumptions about your financial situation, they were reasonable assumptions based on what you showed us. You don't get to stand there with your secret millions and act like we're the villains for caring about you. The defense was passionate and revealed the depth of his hurt. Bob genuinely believed that their concern had been loving, that their offers of help had been generous, that their inclusion of me in family activities had been kind. The possibility that these gestures had been tainted by condescension, that their love had been conditional on their perception of my need for their support, was too painful for him to acknowledge directly. Amanda leaned forward, her interior designer training making her focus on the visual contradictions of my choices. Sarah, I have to ask. When you come to family events, when you show up in clothes from thrift stores while we're wearing designer outfits, when you decline expensive activities because you say you can't afford them, what are you trying to prove? What point are you making? The question revealed her assumption that my choices were performative rather than genuine, that my lifestyle was a statement directed at them rather than a preference that existed independently of their observations. She couldn't conceive that someone might dress modestly because they found beauty in simplicity, might avoid expensive activities because they preferred authentic experiences, might choose contentment over consumption without making a political or philosophical point. I wasn't trying to prove anything to you, I said. I was trying to prove something to myself. I wanted to know if I could find happiness without using wealth as a tool, if I could build genuine relationships without money as a mediating factor, if I could develop authentic interests and values without financial pressure influencing my choices. David's expression shifted from anger to something approaching professional curiosity. And what did you discover? After 3 years of this experiment in voluntary simplicity, what conclusions did you reach? The question was more generous than his previous challenges, suggesting that his legal training had kicked in, making him genuinely interested in the evidence I had gathered during my unconventional approach to wealth management. But it also revealed his continued inability to understand that my choices hadn't been experimental so much as instinctive, hadn't been temporary so much as sustainable. I discovered that most of the things people spend money trying to achieve can be found in simpler ways. I discovered that relationships based on genuine connection are more satisfying than relationships based on mutual utility. I discovered that work you choose for its intrinsic value is more fulfilling than work you choose for its external rewards. I discovered that contentment is possible regardless of your bank balance, but only if you don't confuse having options with needing to exercise all of them. Jessica made a sound that was half laugh, half scoff. Easy to say when you have $45 million backing up your philosophy. Try discovering contentment when you're actually worried about paying rent, when you're actually concerned about your children's college funds, when you're actually struggling with the real financial pressures that most people face. The challenge was fair and pointed to the fundamental tension in my situation. Jessica had identified the core criticism of my approach, that choosing simplicity while possessing wealth was fundamentally different from accepting simplicity due to circumstance, that voluntary limitation was a luxury unavailable to people facing involuntary constraints. You're absolutely right, I agreed. My contentment was always qualified by security. My simplicity was always voluntary rather than imposed. My choices were always backed by resources that most people don't have access to, but that doesn't invalidate what I learned about happiness, relationships, and authentic satisfaction. It just means my learning came from a position of privilege that I acknowledge and don't take for granted. The admission seemed to deflate some of the anger in our small circle. Bob's shoulders relaxed slightly, Amanda's rigid posture softened, and even Jessica's defensive stance became less pronounced. Perhaps they had expected me to argue that my wealth was irrelevant to my happiness, to insist that my choices would have been the same regardless of my financial security. Instead, I had acknowledged what they all knew intuitively, that having options changes everything, even when you choose not to exercise them. But the momentary easing of tension was interrupted by David's legal mind focusing on a practical concern that none of us had yet addressed directly. Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss. If you've had access to this money for 3 years, if you've been meeting with wealth managers and making financial decisions, if you've been managing a $45 million portfolio, then you've also been making choices about how much of this information to share with family members who might be affected by your decisions. The observation was careful and strategic, the kind of point an attorney makes when they're building toward a larger argument. David had recognized that my financial situation didn't exist in isolation, that my choices about disclosure had implications beyond simple family dynamics, that my wealth management decisions might have consequences for other people's financial planning and estate considerations. What exactly are you suggesting, David? I asked, though I suspected I already knew where his legal reasoning was leading him. His response was measured and professional, the tone he used when delivering difficult news to clients. I'm suggesting that family members have legitimate interests in understanding the financial landscape they're operating in. If you have substantial assets that might affect estate planning, gift tax strategies, or intergenerational wealth transfer, then keeping that information secret doesn't just affect your choices, it affects everyone else's ability to make informed decisions about their own financial planning. The argument was sophisticated and compelling, revealing David's ability to frame personal family issues in terms of broader legal and financial principles. He had identified a genuine tension in my approach, the possibility that my privacy about my wealth had prevented other family members from making optimal decisions about their own financial strategies. Jessica seized on David's point with obvious relief, finally finding an argument that felt more legitimate than simple hurt feelings. Exactly, Sarah, if we had known about your resources, we might have made different choices about our own financial priorities. We might have saved differently, invested differently, planned differently. Your secrecy didn't just affect you, it affected all of us. The accusation was gaining momentum now, supported by David's legal framework and Jessica's emotional investment in being right about something. But it also revealed their continued inability to understand that my financial situation was fundamentally separate from theirs, that my wealth was not a family resource to be collectively managed, that my choices about disclosure were not obligations to their financial planning processes. My money was never your money, I said quietly. My wealth was never a factor in your financial decisions because it was never available for your financial decisions. The trust fund belongs to me alone, is managed according to my instructions, and exists independently of any family financial planning considerations. Bob stepped forward, his paternal instincts engaged now in ways that went beyond simple hurt feelings. Sarah, you're missing the point. We're not saying your money belongs to us, or that we have any claim on your resources. We're saying that family members should be honest with each other about significant circumstances that affect the family dynamic. We're saying that letting us worry about you when worry was unnecessary was unkind, regardless of your philosophical reasons for doing it. The criticism was the most thoughtful and measured response I had heard from any of them, acknowledging my right to privacy while challenging the ethics of my secrecy. Bob had identified something that had troubled me during my 3 years of chosen silence, the knowledge that my family's concern for my well-being was genuine, even if it was based on incomplete information, and that allowing that concern to continue when it was unnecessary might constitute a form of emotional manipulation. You're right, I acknowledged. There were times when your worry was genuine, and my silence was unkind. There were moments when I could have eased your concerns without compromising my principles or changing my lifestyle. There were opportunities for honesty that I chose not to take because preserving my experiment felt more important than preserving your peace of mind. The admission seemed to create a small opening in the tension that had dominated our conversation, a moment when acknowledgement of mutual responsibility replaced the cycle of accusation and defense that had been building between us. For the first time since my revelation began, we seemed to be approaching something that resembled actual communication rather than positional warfare. But the moment of potential reconciliation was interrupted by Amanda's voice, carrying a note of discovery that changed the entire tone of our exchange. "Wait a minute," she said slowly, her interior designer training making her notice details that others might miss. "Sarah, that business card you showed us, Sterling and Associates Wealth Management. Their offices are in the financial district downtown, aren't they? In the Wellington building." The question seemed innocent enough, but something in Amanda's tone suggested she was building toward a point that none of us had yet recognized. I nodded, uncertain where her observation was leading but sensing that the shift in her attention from emotional issues to practical details might be significant. "I've been in that building," Amanda continued, her voice gaining confidence as she pursued her line of reasoning. "I did a consultation for a client who has offices on the 32nd floor. Sterling and Associates is on the 35th floor, isn't it? The penthouse level, where they only lease to the most exclusive firms, the ones that manage portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Jessica's expression began to change as she processed Amanda's information, her marketing background making her recognize the implications of premium real estate and exclusive clientele.
Legal training made him understand immediately that Amanda was providing independent verification of my claims, evidence that supported rather than challenged the information I had presented. "Sarah," Amanda said carefully, "if you're really a client of Sterling and Associates, if they're really managing a $45 million portfolio for you, then you're not just wealthy. You're wealthy in ways that put you in a completely different category from anything we've ever experienced or understood." The observation hung in the country club air like a revelation within a revelation, adding weight and specificity to what had already been an overwhelming evening of discoveries. Amanda had identified something that even I had perhaps not fully grasped, that my wealth wasn't just substantial in absolute terms, it was substantial enough to place me in an entirely different social and economic category from the family members who had been patronizing me for years.
The implications of that recognition were about to change our conversation in ways that none of us had anticipated, shifting our focus from family dynamics and hurt feelings to questions about identity, responsibility, and the fundamental nature of the relationships we had all assumed we understood. Part 7. The Real Numbers. Amanda's observation about Sterling and Associates' exclusive clientele settled over our group like a heavy blanket, muffling the country club's ambient sounds and making our conversation feel suddenly more serious, more consequential. I could see each family member processing this new layer of information, trying to understand not just that I had money, but that I had the kind of money that operated in rarefied circles they had never even imagined accessing. Jessica was the first to break the silence, but her voice had lost the angry edge that had characterized her earlier responses. Now she sounded smaller, more uncertain, like someone trying to navigate unfamiliar territory without a map. Sarah, when you say $45 million, are we talking about investment accounts, real estate holdings, business interests? What exactly does that number represent? The question revealed her attempt to contextualize my wealth in terms she could understand, to break it down into categories that might make it feel less overwhelming, less incomprehensible. Jessica's marketing background had taught her to deal with large budgets and significant financial commitments, but those experiences operated in the thousands or low millions, not the tens of millions that represented generational wealth. I looked around at their faces, seeing genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been respect, and realized that my earlier revelations had only scratched the surface of what they needed to understand about my situation. The $45 million is the current market value of a diversified investment portfolio that includes stocks, bonds, real estate investment trusts, and alternative investments, but that's just the managed assets. There are also direct real estate holdings, including commercial properties in 3 states, and a separate education fund that Nana established for any future children I might have. David's legal training made him the first to grasp the full implications of what I was describing. Sarah, you're talking about a comprehensive wealth management structure that goes far beyond simple inheritance. This sounds like generational wealth planning, the kind of financial architecture that families build over decades to ensure long-term prosperity. His observation was accurate and revealed something I had been slow to fully appreciate myself. Grandmother Nana hadn't just left me money, she had created a financial foundation designed to support not just my lifetime, but the lifetimes of children and grandchildren I might eventually have. The trust fund wasn't a windfall, it was a legacy intended to span generations. Bob's expression had shifted from hurt and anger to something approaching awe. Sarah, your grandmother never mentioned anything like this to me. When she talked about providing for you, I thought she meant college funds, maybe a small inheritance to help you get started in life. I never imagined she was talking about this level of financial planning. The admission revealed the depth of his confusion and perhaps his own limitations in understanding his mother's financial sophistication. Bob had always seen Nana as a comfortable retiree with modest savings and a nice house. The idea that she had possessed the knowledge and resources to structure complex wealth transfers worth tens of millions of dollars challenged his fundamental understanding of who she had been and what she had been capable of achieving. Amanda leaned forward, her professional curiosity engaged now in ways that went beyond family drama. Sarah, I have to ask about the real estate holdings you mentioned. Are we talking about residential properties, commercial buildings, development projects? And in which states? The question revealed her designer's instinct for understanding the physical manifestations of wealth, the tangible assets that represented not just money, but strategic investment in appreciating resources. She was trying to grasp the scope of my holdings in terms she could visualize and evaluate. There are office buildings in downtown Denver and Phoenix, several retail shopping centers in growing suburban markets, and residential rental properties in university towns with stable tenant bases, I explained. The strategy focuses on income-producing assets in markets with strong demographic trends and limited supply constraints. Jessica made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a laugh. Sarah, you're talking about a real estate empire. You're describing the kind of property portfolio that generates millions of dollars in annual rental income. Her observation was accurate but revealed her continued struggle to reconcile this financial reality with the sister she thought she knew. Jessica was trying to process the contradiction between someone who counted quarters for laundry and someone who owned commercial real estate across multiple states, between someone who worked at a coffee shop and someone who managed a property portfolio worth tens of millions. David's expression had become intensely focused, his legal mind working through implications and complications that the rest of us might not have considered. Sarah, managing assets of this scale requires sophisticated legal and tax planning. You must have attorneys specializing in estate planning, tax specialists who understand complex trust structures, accountants who handle multi-state property management. This isn't just wealth. This is wealth that requires professional management infrastructure. His assessment was completely accurate and pointed to something I had been reluctant to discuss: the team of professionals who helped me manage my financial responsibilities. Michael Chen at Sterling and Associates was just the most visible member of a group that included estate planning attorneys, tax specialists, property managers, and financial advisors who worked together to optimize my portfolio's performance while minimizing legal and tax complications. There are 7 people who work directly on managing various aspects of the portfolio, I acknowledged. Property managers who handle tenant relations and maintenance issues, tax attorneys who ensure compliance with state and federal regulations, investment advisors who make recommendations about asset allocation and market timing. It's like having a small company dedicated to managing my financial affairs. Bob shook his head slowly, the insurance manager in him recognizing the complexity and cost of such comprehensive professional management. Sarah, the fees alone for that level of service must be substantial. You're talking about annual expenses that probably exceed most people's total income. He was right. And his observation pointed to something that even I sometimes found difficult to fully grasp: that managing significant wealth required spending significant amounts of money on professional services, that the costs of optimization and protection escalated along with the value of the assets being managed. The annual management fees are approximately $400,000, I said quietly, watching their expressions change as they processed this information. But the portfolio generates enough income to cover those expenses while still producing substantial returns that get reinvested to maintain growth. Amanda's designer sensibilities made her focus on the lifestyle implications of such enormous financial resources. Sarah, I'm still trying to understand why you choose to live the way you do. With the income this portfolio must generate, you could afford anything. Any house, any car, any vacation, any experience. You could live like royalty if you wanted to. The question revealed her continued inability to understand that having unlimited options didn't necessarily create unlimited desires, that financial capacity to purchase anything didn't automatically generate interest in purchasing everything, that wealth could be a tool for creating freedom rather than accumulating possessions. The portfolio generates approximately $2.8 million in annual income after taxes and management fees, I explained. That's enough to support any lifestyle I might want to pursue. But what I discovered over the past 3 years is that the lifestyle I actually want doesn't require spending millions of dollars to achieve. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper when she responded. Sarah, you earn more money in passive investment income each year than David and I earn combined from our careers. You earn more money each month than most people earn in an entire year, and you choose to work at a coffee shop for $12 an hour. The stark comparison highlighted the surreal nature of my situation, the disconnect between my financial capacity and my chosen lifestyle that had been driving their confusion and resentment all evening. Jessica had finally grasped the full scope of the contradiction they had been struggling to understand: someone with unlimited financial freedom, choosing circumstances that appeared to represent significant limitation. David leaned back in his chair, his legal training making him approach the situation with careful analysis rather than emotional reaction. Sarah, I need to ask about the legal structure of these holdings. Are you the sole beneficiary of the trust, or are there other family members who have interests in these assets? Are there conditions or restrictions that affect your access to the principal amounts, or do you have complete discretionary control? The questions revealed his understanding that complex wealth structures often included provisions designed to protect assets from beneficiary inexperience, creditor claims, or family disputes. He was trying to determine whether my control over the wealth was absolute or subject to external oversight and restriction. I have complete discretionary control over all assets and income, I replied. The trust terminated when I turned 25 and demonstrated 3 years of financial independence. Everything transferred to my direct ownership at that point, with no restrictions, conditions, or oversight requirements. The information seemed to surprise David, whose experience with wealthy clients had taught him that most families preferred to maintain some level of structural protection even after beneficiaries reached maturity. That's unusual, Sarah. Most estate planners recommend maintaining some form of trust protection indefinitely, especially for assets of this magnitude. His observation was accurate and pointed to something distinctive about grandmother Nana's approach to wealth transfer. She had prioritized my autonomy and independence over asset protection, choosing to trust my judgment completely rather than building in safeguards against potential mismanagement or external threats. Nana's instructions were very specific, I explained. She wanted me to have complete freedom to make my own choices, even if those choices were different from what others might recommend. She believed that wealth should enhance autonomy rather than create dependency, that having resources should increase freedom rather than create obligation to use them in conventional ways. Bob's expression softened as he processed this information about his mother's intentions and philosophy. That sounds like her, he admitted. Helen always valued independence above security, always believed that people needed to find their own paths rather than following prescribed formulas for success. The observation revealed a side of grandmother Nana that I had known intimately but that perhaps Bob had understood less clearly. She had possessed the rare combination of financial sophistication and philosophical depth that allowed her to structure complex wealth transfers while maintaining focus on the human values and personal development that she considered more important than mere asset accumulation. Amanda's voice carried a note of wonder when she spoke again. Sarah, do you realize what this means in practical terms? You could quit your job tomorrow and never work again. You could travel anywhere, live anywhere, do anything you wanted for the rest of your life. You could support charities, start foundations, influence political campaigns, make a difference in ways that most people can only dream about. Her observations were accurate and highlighted possibilities I had been contemplating during my 3 years of financial awakening. The wealth grandmother Nana had entrusted to me wasn't just personal security, it was potential social influence, the capacity to affect change, the resources to support causes and organizations that aligned with my values and priorities. All of that is true, I acknowledged. But what I learned during these 3 years is that having the power to do anything made it more important to choose carefully what I actually wanted to do. Having unlimited options forced me to think deeply about what would bring genuine satisfaction, rather than just immediate gratification. Jessica shook her head, still struggling to reconcile my choices with the opportunities my wealth represented. Sarah, I understand wanting to be thoughtful about your choices, but you've spent 3 years working at a job that pays minimum wage while sitting on resources that could fund entire charitable organizations. Don't you feel some responsibility to use your wealth for something more significant than personal philosophical exploration? The challenge was thoughtful and pointed to tensions I had been grappling with throughout my period of chosen simplicity. Jessica had identified a genuine ethical question about the responsibilities that came with extraordinary wealth, the obligations to use resources for social benefit rather than personal experimentation. The weight of that question, combined with the evening's revelations and confrontations, was about to shift our conversation into territory that none of us had anticipated when we started discussing my financial situation. We were moving beyond family dynamics and hurt feelings into fundamental questions about wealth, responsibility, and the purpose of resources that exceeded anything most people would ever possess. Standing there in that country club, surrounded by the symbols of success and status that had seemed so significant when the evening began, I realized that my 3-year experiment in chosen simplicity was about to evolve into something larger and more complex than personal philosophical exploration. The $45 million wasn't just my inheritance, it was my opportunity to demonstrate that Grandmother Nana's faith in my character had been justified in ways that extended far beyond managing money wisely. Part 8. The web of assumptions unravels. Jessica's question about responsibility hung in the air between us like a challenge I couldn't ignore. For 3 years I had been focused on learning who I was without the influence of wealth, but her point about using resources for something more significant than personal exploration forced me to confront the next phase of what Grandmother Nana had entrusted to me. The country club setting, with its careful displays of status and success, suddenly felt like the wrong place to be having such a profound conversation about purpose and obligation. "You're asking the right questions, Jessica," I said carefully, "and I've been asking them too. The difference is that I spent 3 years learning what mattered to me before I started making decisions about how to use resources that could affect thousands of other people's lives." David leaned forward, his legal training making him recognize the complexity of wealth management decisions that extended beyond personal financial planning. "Sarah, are you saying you've been developing some kind of philanthropic strategy, some plan for using these resources for charitable or social purposes?" The question revealed his understanding that wealth at my level carried implications beyond personal lifestyle choices, that managing tens of millions of dollars inevitably involved decisions about social impact and community responsibility. But it also showed his assumption that philanthropy was something that required formal planning and institutional structure, rather than organic development based on authentic understanding of community needs. "I've been developing relationships," I replied. "Real relationships with people whose lives aren't insulated by wealth, who face challenges that money can solve, but only if it's applied thoughtfully and respectfully." Working at Brewster's Coffee House wasn't just about learning contentment, it was about understanding what actual problems look like from the inside. Amanda's expression shifted as she began to grasp the implications of what I was describing. "You mean you've been doing research? Studying poverty and financial stress, not from academic or charitable distance, but from daily proximity to people who experience it directly?" Her observation was more perceptive than I had expected, revealing her ability to understand strategic thinking even when it operated outside her usual professional context. She had recognized that my choice to work at a coffee shop and live modestly hadn't been merely philosophical, it had been investigative, a way of gathering information about how financial stress affected real people in real situations. "Mrs. Henderson comes in every morning for decaf, with extra foam and a dash of cinnamon," I said, looking around at their faces. "She's 73 years old, lives on Social Security and a small pension from her late husband's job at the post office. She budgets $12 a week for coffee because it's the one small luxury she allows herself, but she tips me whatever change she has left after buying groceries each Friday." Bob's expression softened as he recognized the human specificity of what I was describing, the way individual stories differed from statistical abstractions about poverty and financial constraint among elderly Americans. "Marcus Williams works 2 jobs to support his mother and younger sister, while finishing his degree in computer science at the community college," I continued. He comes in at 6 every morning before his shift at the warehouse, orders black coffee and studies for his programming classes in the corner booth. He's brilliant, motivated, and stuck in a cycle where working enough hours to support his family leaves him too exhausted to excel academically. Jessica's marketing background made her understand the power of individual stories to illustrate larger social issues, but she was struggling to connect these personal narratives to the broader question of how my wealth should be deployed for maximum social benefit. Sarah, these are touching stories, and I'm sure you've learned a lot about the challenges working-class people face. But knowing individual stories doesn't necessarily translate into effective strategies for using financial resources to create systemic change. Her challenge was fair and revealed the tension between personal relationship and institutional impact that I had been grappling with throughout my 3 years of chosen simplicity. She was right that understanding individual stories didn't automatically generate solutions that could be scaled to address broader social problems. You're absolutely right, I acknowledged. But what I learned is that most philanthropic strategies fail because they're designed by people who understand systems but don't understand individuals. They create programs that look good on paper, but don't address the actual obstacles that prevent people like Marcus from breaking out of cycles that limit their potential. David's legal experience with nonprofit organizations made him recognize the validity of my observation. Sarah's got a point there. I've worked with several charitable foundations, and there's often a disconnect between board-level strategy and ground-level implementation. The people making funding decisions rarely have direct experience with the problems they're trying to solve. His support surprised me, suggesting that his initial skepticism about my choices was evolving into recognition that my unconventional approach might have generated insights that traditional philanthropic planning typically missed. Amanda seemed to be processing the conversation on multiple levels simultaneously, her designer's training making her think about systems and aesthetics, while her family loyalty made her grapple with the personal implications of my revelations. So what you're saying, Sarah, is that you've been conducting a 3-year field study in economic inequality, using yourself as the primary research instrument. The framework she provided was more sophisticated than I had expected, revealing her ability to understand my approach in academic terms that gave it legitimacy beyond mere personal experimentation. She had identified something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself, that my chosen lifestyle had been a form of participatory research designed to generate authentic understanding of social problems I eventually planned to address. That's part of it, I agreed. But it was also about learning whether I could find satisfaction and meaning without using wealth as a shortcut to comfort and status. I needed to know if my values were genuine or just theoretical before I started making decisions about how to use resources that could affect hundreds of thousands of people. Bob's expression had been shifting throughout our conversation, moving from hurt and anger through confusion toward something that looked like grudging respect. Sarah, I have to admit, what you're describing sounds like the kind of character testing your grandmother always believed in. She used to say that people revealed their true nature when they had choices, not when they were forced into circumstances. The observation touched something deep in my understanding of what Grandmother Nana had been trying to achieve through the complex structure she had created for my inheritance. She hadn't just wanted me to have financial security, she had wanted me to develop the wisdom and character necessary to use wealth responsibly, to understand both its potential benefits and its corrupting dangers. Every quarter when I met with Michael Chen to review portfolio performance, he would ask if I was ready to begin accessing the income stream for lifestyle enhancement, I explained. Every quarter I would tell him I needed more time to understand what kind of life I actually wanted to build, rather than what kind of life I could afford to purchase. Jessica's voice carried a note of wonder mixed with something that might have been admiration. So you've been turning down millions of dollars in available income while working for $12 an hour, and letting us worry about your financial security. The summary was accurate but didn't capture the full complexity of what those choices had meant in practical terms. Turning down access to millions of dollars hadn't been a simple matter of philosophical preference. It had required daily discipline, constant recommitment to values that were easier to maintain in theory than in practice. There were moments when it was harder than others, I admitted, when Mrs. Henderson mentioned that she couldn't afford her blood pressure medication because of an unexpected car repair. When Marcus fell asleep over his textbooks because he'd worked a double shift and still needed to study for an exam that could determine his future. When I had the resources to solve their problems immediately but couldn't do it without revealing information that would change the authenticity of our relationships. David's legal training made him recognize the ethical complexity of the situations I was describing. You're talking about a classic problem in social work and community development. How do you help people without creating dependency or destroying the genuine connections that make help effective? His observation revealed understanding that went beyond simple legal or financial advice, suggesting that our evening's revelations had pushed him to think about questions he rarely encountered in his normal professional practice. The conversation was forcing all of us to grapple with issues that extended far beyond family dynamics into fundamental questions about wealth, responsibility, and authentic relationship. Amanda's expression had become thoughtful in ways that suggested she was beginning to see connections between my approach and principles she understood from her own professional experience. In interior design, the most successful projects happen when clients have a clear understanding of how they actually live rather than how they think they should live. It sounds like you've been doing something similar with wealth management, learning how you actually want to use resources rather than how wealthy people are supposed to use them. Amanda's parallel between interior design and wealth management opened something in our conversation that had been building all evening. The country club's elegant atmosphere seemed to fade around us as we grappled with questions that none of us had expected to confront when the evening began. Her observation had touched on something fundamental about the difference between authentic choice and performative decision-making, between living according to internal values and living according to external expectations. That's exactly what I've been doing, I said, feeling a clarity that had been building throughout our confrontation. Learning how I actually want to live rather than how someone with $45 million is supposed to live. And what I discovered is that most of the things wealth is supposed to provide can be found in simpler ways, while some of the most important things in life can't be purchased at any price. Jessica's expression had been evolving throughout our conversation, moving from anger through confusion towards something that looked like genuine curiosity. Sarah, I'm beginning to understand what you were trying to accomplish, but I still don't understand what happens next. You can't work at a coffee shop forever, not when you have resources that could make a real difference in the world. At some point, this philosophical experiment has to evolve into practical action. Her challenge was thoughtful and revealed her recognition that my 3-year period of chosen simplicity had been preparation rather than destination, research rather than conclusion. She was right that understanding the nature of authentic satisfaction and genuine relationship was only valuable if it led to meaningful application of the resources I had been entrusted with. You're absolutely right, I acknowledged, and that transition is already beginning to happen. Next month, I'm meeting with community development specialists and social entrepreneurs to discuss launching a foundation focused on removing systemic barriers that prevent people like Marcus from achieving their potential. David's legal training made him immediately interested in the practical and structural aspects of what I was describing. Sarah, are you talking about a private foundation, a donor-advised fund, or some kind of direct investment approach? The legal structure you choose will significantly affect both the impact you can have and the tax implications of your charitable giving. His question revealed his understanding that philanthropic strategy required the same kind of sophisticated planning as wealth management, that good intentions needed to be channeled through effective institutional structures to achieve meaningful results. But it also showed his assumption that impact required formal charitable mechanisms rather than more direct approaches to social change. I'm still exploring different models, I replied. But what I've learned from 3 years of daily interaction with people facing real economic challenges is that the most effective interventions are often the most direct ones. Sometimes the solution isn't creating another nonprofit organization. Sometimes it's just removing specific obstacles that prevent motivated people from succeeding. Bob's expression had softened considerably as he processed the scope and thoughtfulness of what I was describing. Sarah, it sounds like you've been planning this for a long time. This wasn't just about learning to live simply, it was about preparing to use your resources wisely. His observation touched something important about grandmother Nana's intentions and my own evolving understanding of what she had been trying to accomplish through the complex structure she had created for my inheritance. She hadn't just wanted me to possess wealth, she had wanted me to develop the character and wisdom necessary to use it effectively for purposes larger than personal gratification. Every morning when I made coffee for Mrs. Henderson, every evening when I watched Marcus struggle to balance work and school, every time I chose contentment over consumption, I was learning something that no business school or philanthropic consulting firm could have taught me, I explained. I was learning what actual problems look like from the inside, what real solutions require, what kind of help is genuinely helpful rather than just well-intentioned. Amanda leaned forward, her professional curiosity fully engaged now. Sarah, can you give us a specific example? What does removing systemic barriers look like in practice? And how does your approach differ from traditional charitable strategies? The question was fair and important, challenging me to move beyond philosophical generalities into concrete descriptions of how my unconventional preparation might translate into effective action. She was asking me to demonstrate that my 3 years of chosen simplicity had generated genuine insights rather than just personal satisfaction. Marcus Williams, the student I mentioned who works 2 jobs while studying computer science, I began. Traditional scholarship programs might offer him tuition assistance, but that doesn't address the fundamental problem that prevents him from succeeding academically. He works 60 hours a week because his family depends on his income for basic survival. No amount of educational support will help him excel if he's too exhausted from work to concentrate on his studies. Jessica's marketing background made her recognize the systemic nature of the problem I was describing. So you're talking about addressing the underlying economic pressures that make academic success difficult, not just providing educational resources. Her understanding was accurate and revealed something important about the difference between conventional charitable approaches and the more comprehensive interventions that my research had suggested might be more effective. Most philanthropic strategies focused on symptoms rather than causes, providing support within existing systems rather than changing the systems themselves. Exactly, I confirmed. What Marcus needs isn't just tuition assistance, he needs family economic stability that allows him to focus on education without sacrificing his relatives' basic needs. That might mean providing living expense support for his mother and sister, healthcare assistance that reduces their financial vulnerability, or even direct investment in small business opportunities that could generate sustainable income for the family. David's legal experience with complex financial structures made him recognize the sophistication of the approach I was describing. Sarah, you're talking about comprehensive social investment rather than traditional charity. You're describing interventions that address root causes rather than just alleviating immediate suffering. His observation was perceptive and highlighted the distinction between the approach I had been developing and the more conventional philanthropic strategies that most wealthy individuals pursued. Traditional charity often focused on providing temporary relief from symptoms of systemic problems. What I was contemplating was more like social investment designed to address underlying causes of economic vulnerability. The foundation I'm planning won't just distribute grants to worthy causes, I continued. It will identify specific individuals whose potential is being limited by solvable financial obstacles, then design comprehensive interventions that remove those obstacles permanently rather than just temporarily. Bob's insurance background made him recognize the actuarial sophistication of what I was describing. Sarah, you're talking about risk assessment and outcome optimization on an individual level. That's incredibly resource-intensive but potentially much more effective than broad-based programming that tries to help everyone a little bit instead of helping specific people completely. His understanding surprised me and revealed aspects of his professional expertise that I hadn't fully appreciated before. Bob's work in insurance had taught him to think about risk mitigation and outcome prediction in ways that translated directly to the kind of targeted social investment I was contemplating. Amanda's expression had become increasingly thoughtful as she processed the implications of our conversation. So your 3 years of working at the coffee shop wasn't just personal philosophical exploration, it was market research for a philanthropic strategy that most wealthy people never have access to because they don't spend time with the people they're trying to help. Her summary was more sophisticated than I had expected, revealing her ability to understand strategic thinking even when it operated outside her usual professional context. She had recognized that my unconventional approach to wealth management had generated insights that couldn't be obtained through traditional methods of philanthropic planning. Traditional philanthropy operates from distance, I explained. Wealthy donors make decisions based on grant applications, site visits, and annual reports. They understand problems intellectually but rarely experience them personally. What I learned from daily proximity to economic struggle is that the most effective interventions are often the most specific ones, designed around individual circumstances rather than general categories of need. Jessica's voice carried a note of genuine admiration when she responded, "Sarah, I have to admit, what you've accomplished is extraordinary. You've turned inheritance into education, turned wealth into wisdom, turned resources into relationships that could actually make a difference." The acknowledgement was unexpected and generous, revealing her ability to move beyond personal hurt toward recognition of something larger and more important than family dynamics. Jessica had recognized that my choices, however initially painful to her assumptions about our relationship, had been serving purposes that extended far beyond personal preference or philosophical experimentation. "But I need to ask you something," Jessica continued, her voice becoming more serious. "After tonight, after revealing all of this to us, how does this change our family relationships? How do we move forward when everything we thought we knew about each other has been turned upside down?" The question was profound and necessary, addressing the emotional aftermath of revelations that had fundamentally altered the dynamics between us. Jessica had recognized that knowledge couldn't be unknown, that assumptions once exposed couldn't be restored, that our relationships would need to be rebuilt on foundations that acknowledged the new realities we all now understood. David leaned back in his chair, his legal training making him approach the question with systematic analysis. Jessica's right to ask about the practical implications of tonight's revelations. We've all been operating from false assumptions about Sarah's circumstances, and those assumptions shaped how we interacted with her, how we made decisions about family gatherings, how we allocated our own resources and attention. His observation was clinical but accurate, identifying the ways that incomplete information had distorted our family dynamics over the past 3 years. Every gesture of supposed generosity, every expression of concern, every offer of assistance had been predicated on beliefs about my circumstances that were fundamentally incorrect. "I don't want our relationships to be transactional," I said carefully. "I don't want you to feel like you need to treat me differently because of my financial circumstances. What I hope is that we can build relationships based on genuine connection rather than assumptions about relative need or capacity." Amanda's expression had become thoughtful in ways that suggested she was processing not just the immediate implications of our conversation but the broader questions it raised about authenticity and relationship. "Sarah, that's a beautiful sentiment, but you have to acknowledge that money changes things whether we want it to or not. Knowledge of your wealth will inevitably affect how we think about interactions, decisions, opportunities." Her observation was honest and important, acknowledging the reality that financial circumstances affect relationships even when people try to prevent them from doing so. She was right that my wealth would inevitably influence family dynamics, regardless of anyone's intentions to keep those influences at bay. "You're absolutely right," I acknowledged, "and that's why I chose to wait 3 years before revealing this information. I wanted to give all of us the opportunity to know each other as we actually are, rather than as what our financial circumstances might suggest we should become." Bob stepped forward, his paternal instincts making him focus on the healing aspects of our conversation rather than the divisive ones. Sarah, I want you to know that learning about your resources doesn't change how I feel about you as my daughter. If anything, it makes me proud of the wisdom you've shown in managing something that could have easily corrupted your values or isolated you from authentic relationships. The acknowledgement was unexpected and deeply moving, revealing Bob's ability to move beyond his own hurt toward recognition of the character development that my unconventional approach had required. He had recognized that managing extraordinary wealth without allowing it to corrupt personal values was an achievement that deserved respect rather than resentment. Jessica nodded slowly, her expression suggesting that she was beginning to process the evening's revelations in a broader context. Sarah, I owe you an apology. When I called your fortune loose change, when I dismissed your lifestyle choices as naive or impractical, when I assumed you needed our help and guidance, I was revealing my own limitations rather than identifying yours. The apology was generous and revealed her capacity for self-reflection that went beyond simple acknowledgement of factual errors. She had recognized that her condescension had been based on her own narrow understanding of success and happiness, rather than on accurate assessment of my circumstances or choices. Thank you for saying that, I replied. But I also owe all of you an apology for allowing you to operate from incomplete information for so long. There were moments when I could have been more honest without compromising my principles, when I could have eased your concerns without revealing details about my financial situation. David's legal training made him recognize the mutual responsibility that our conversation had revealed. I think we all made assumptions that served our own psychological needs rather than reflecting accurate understanding of each other's circumstances. Sarah assumed we couldn't love her without pitying her. We assumed she couldn't be happy without our assistance. His observation was sophisticated and revealed the complex ways that incomplete information and false assumptions had distorted all of our perspectives, creating a web of misunderstanding that had affected every family interaction over the past 3 years. Amanda looked around at our small group, her designer's eye perhaps seeing us differently than she had when the evening began. So where do we go from here? How do we rebuild family relationships on foundations that acknowledge what we've all learned tonight? The question was practical and necessary, challenging us to move beyond revelation and confrontation toward reconstruction of relationships that had been fundamentally altered by new understanding. She was asking us to envision a future based on truth rather than assumption, on genuine connection rather than perceived obligation. I think we start by acknowledging that we're all different people than we were when this evening began, I suggested. We start by recognizing that love doesn't require rescue, that family doesn't require inequality, that relationships can be based on mutual respect rather than perceived need. Jessica smiled, and for the first time all evening, the expression seemed completely genuine. Sarah, I think I'm beginning to understand what your grandmother saw in you, why she structured her legacy the way she did, why she trusted you with resources that could have easily overwhelmed someone with less character and wisdom. The observation touched something deep in my understanding of what this entire experience had been designed to accomplish. Grandmother Nana hadn't just wanted to provide me with financial security, she had wanted to create circumstances that would allow me to develop the strength, wisdom, and authenticity necessary to use wealth as a tool for good, rather than as an end in itself. Looking around at my family's faces in that moment, seeing understanding replace assumption, respect replace condescension, and authentic curiosity replace false concern, I realized that the $45 million had been the least important part of what Grandmother Nana had given me. She had given me the opportunity to learn who I was when nobody was trying to change me, to discover what mattered when nothing was forcing my choices, to build relationships that weren't distorted by financial inequality. The country club setting that had seemed so imposing when I arrived now felt smaller and less significant. The crystal and marble, the designer clothing and expensive jewelry, all the symbols of success that I could have afforded but had chosen not to pursue, seemed less important than the authentic connections I was finally able to have with people who mattered to me. As we prepared to leave that evening, as the country club staff began cleaning up the remnants of Jessica's anniversary celebration, I realized that my real inheritance hadn't been money at all. It had been the wisdom to understand that wealth without character was worthless, that security without authenticity was empty, that resources without relationships were meaningless. The foundation I was planning, the community development work I was preparing to undertake, the systematic approach to removing barriers that prevented motivated people from achieving their potential, all of these were simply applications of what I had learned during 3 years of chosen simplicity. They were ways of using the resources grandmother Nana had entrusted to me to create the kind of world she had envisioned, a place where people were valued for who they were rather than what they possessed, where potential was nurtured rather than constrained by economic circumstance, where wealth served wisdom rather than replacing it. Walking out of the Riverside Country Club that night, surrounded by family members who finally knew me as I actually was rather than as they had assumed I should be, I understood that the most valuable thing I possessed wasn't in any investment portfolio or real estate holding. It was the knowledge that contentment could exist independently of consumption, that happiness could flourish without luxury, that the most meaningful relationships were built on truth rather than assumption. The $45 million would allow me to make a difference in ways that extended far beyond my own circumstances. But the 3 years I had spent learning to find satisfaction in simplicity, to value authenticity over appearance, to choose contentment over accumulation, those were the years that had prepared me to use wealth wisely rather than just spend it lavishly. As we walked through the country club's marble lobby for the last time that evening, I realized that I was no longer the family member who needed saving. I was the one who had saved herself, who had learned to be genuinely free, who had discovered that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money but the wisdom to use it well. And that wisdom, earned through 3 years of deliberate choices and authentic relationships, was worth more than any trust fund could ever provide. The transformation was complete. The experiment in voluntary simplicity had become preparation for purposeful complexity. The season of learning was evolving into a lifetime of application, and the family that had once pitied my limitations was beginning to understand that what they had mistaken for constraints had actually been choices, what they had seen as poverty had actually been richness, what they had interpreted as failure had actually been the most profound kind of success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.